Hey, can everyone put up their hands if they beat Tekken Force mode as a kid? Yeah, me neither. I really like fighting games, and I like them even more when they decide to do things that aren't strictly a fighting game. Morphing into a beat-em-up style experience, or even adding in a completely new gameplay concept to work alongside the usual fighting game stuff is really cool. And when everything clicks together just right, you can get some really interesting experiences, and one series in particular does this sort of thing very well. Soul Calibur has always been what I consider to be a very casual-friendly fighting game series. Most of the mechanics in the core fighting system are pretty easy to understand. One button make go sideways, another make go up and down, others make kick and block. There are of course more complicated mechanics too, but even that stuff is pretty simple to learn if you just spend a little time with it. And just like any fighting game, each character has pretty big differences that make some beginner friendly and others a little more complicated. This series does a good job of communicating this to the player though, making some characters feel more complex just based on their weapon and visual aesthetic. Nightmare has always been an easy character to pick up and do some damage with. He's the guy with a big sword, so you know, big sword like go burr, I guess. That's a really old meme. Then characters like Mitsurugi and Kilik are a little trickier, with weapons that require more precise handling to do well. And then there's Ivy and Voldo, who have weapons that are sexy and sinister in equal measure. Basically, the more complex a weapon looks to wield, the harder the character is going to be to learn. That's not a perfect way to sum it up, but broadly speaking, that's how I've always understood it. But with a roster that ranges so much in technique, it can be hard to settle on just one character sometimes, especially if there's a character you like the look of, but not their style of play. And if there's just the 1v1 fighting, I think the incentive to try and learn weirder characters isn't really there for a casual audience or someone that needs a little more to get them hooked. Side modes that are mainly there to give you something to mess around in and experiment with are typically what I find the most fun to use when learning a new character, outside of the usual labbing, which is always pretty good. Which is why I think Soul Calibur's single player antics makes learning new characters extremely fun. It honestly feels like a lot of this series is almost entirely driven, first and foremost, by side campaigns or weird RPG-like modes, and then are supported by the typical arcade runs that give characters their ending as an extra to the experience. Sure, they aren't to the standard of Tekken's CG cutscene endings, but it's still nice to see how all of these characters' respective journeys culminate in each of the games. You can also see the budget step up each time, with Soul Calibur 2's endings being short slideshows with text, to Soul Calibur 3 having actual cutscenes that can differ depending on whether or not you pass the QuickTime event. Then there's Soul Calibur 4, whose ending cutscenes have some really neat direction and some nice character moments for the roster, with Siegfried's bittersweet ending contrasted amazingly with Nightmare's downright scary one. And then of course, there's Darth Vader doing his thing, which is, yeah, I still can't quite believe Star Wars was a guest in this series. Imagine this happening now in a game that doesn't rhyme with Naught Fight.
What a farce!
And then there's Soul Calibur 5, which has no ending cutscenes at all. That was a bleak time. The meat of Soul Calibur was never based around these endings though. They were cool treats and allowed us to have some kind of understanding about the story at play, but for me, most of the actual game time was spent around playing through modes like Weapon Master, Tower of Lost Souls, and for this video, all of the stuff that Soul Calibur 3 has to offer. Side campaigns like this are not only cool because you get more game to play, but I feel like they're sometimes more interesting to talk about than the core fighting game systems themselves. Trying to morph and finagle the pretty rigid concept of a basic fighting game into something different yields interesting results. There's your Tekken forces, there's that cool open world story in Mortal Kombat Deception, and even now we have World Tour in Street Fighter 6. But none of them are as interesting to me as the stuff that Soul Calibur 3 did. A game that is rather infamously unbalanced, had intricate mechanics from prior entries removed, and was frankly pretty buggy at times, which hampered its popularity in the FGC at the time of its release. But these problems signal where SC3's priorities were. Looking back, it feels like Namco didn't necessarily want to focus on this game's competitiveness, at least at the start, and decided to go all in on honing these single-player aspects instead, which is basically confirmed by the fact that the PS2 release came out before the arcade version, which is why things like timers during character selection and the overall arcadey UI are mostly gone. So if you are specifically wanting a Soul Calibur game with plenty of single-player content and AI that just so happens to not care about your feelings, this is the one for you. Soul Calibur 3 packs a lot of game into this game, and straight away, it kind of goes against the grain of what you'd expect even from Soul Calibur. Normally, underneath the single-player portion of the menu, you'd see options like arcade mode, survival, time attack. Instead, we've got Tales of Souls, Chronicle of the Sword, World Competition, and Soul Arena. Instantly, what Soul Calibur 3 has on offer is more exciting, because I don't know what any of these things are. You get that sense of discovery, like you're delving through unique game modes that'll offer something pretty, unique. Tales of Souls is the usual sort of arcade mode run-through that I talked about before, where you play as one of the characters on the roster and then go through to get their ending. Though it also throws in a lot of new stuff that I haven't really seen many other fighting games do for their comparative modes. Tales of Souls is really cool because it functions like a choose-your-own-adventure style experience. You'll have numerous choices to take depending on what character you choose, and then you'll experience different fights based on those choices. This gets you into some cool battles with other roster members, or maybe a fight against some random NPCs. And they're all bridged together with paragraphs of text that essentially read off like a visual novel. Soul Calibur has always had this fun relationship with the written word, often presenting these battles you take part in as a piece of destined history. It always gave the preamble before fights this lofty attitude that made you feel nice.
His iron fist is unstoppable.
Then there's Tales of Souls, which allows you to craft that journey entirely on your own. And as someone that often ran through the story mode on games like Tekken 5 and Soul Calibur 2 for hours on end, this sort of thing is insanely cool. These choices alone make replaying a character's route to see how other choices play out intriguing. And even if there isn't much that truly changes, going through it again just in case is a really neat experience in itself. What's also fun is the QTEs that certain parts of the route will test you with. Failure usually means you just start the fight with a little less health than you would otherwise, but passing them gives you a sense of accomplishment, which is really what we all crave at the end of the day. I also purposely get hit on Siegfried's route at the very end, just to hear one of the best line deliveries I've ever heard.
Will not lose.
Failing a QTE at the very end of the story for some characters can actually result in a slightly different ending. For Siegfried, if he passes the ending QTE, he proves to himself that he's ready to finally bring his fight against Nightmare and his inner demons to its end, stating that to live on is his redemption for all of the terrible things that he did as Nightmare. But if he fails the QTE, then it's supposed that the spirit of his father saves him in that moment, and this gives him the courage to keep fighting, knowing that he will never quite be alone. Both instances suit the character beautifully, and even though there's not much that changes besides that moment, it's enough for Soul Cal sickos to want to see. Especially with how Soul Calibur 2 teased us with little character interactions at the end of the arcade mode, and with its pretty short endings, I always wanted a lot more. Having so much more character is what makes replaying Tales of Souls again and again really fun. One thing I need to point out though is how wildly inconsistent the AI can be at times. Sometimes they're a complete pushover, and then suddenly you feel like you're up against the best mind readers in the world. It makes Tales of Souls feel like a brisk walk 1 second, and then a fight for your life the next. Now, fighting games having punishing AI is not new, but I can't remember a time when it's been this inconsistent. Even the final boss of the route sometimes gets a little stupid, and it's really funny, until you lose 10 times in a row, and then you just start to feel a bit sad. Tales of Souls is likely to be the mode you spend the most time in, since it's the way you unlock most of the characters and stages. Of course, you can also just play hundreds of matches instead and get the same result, and given how temperamental the AI can be, I can't really figure out which way is quicker. Oh, and while I remember, Soul Calibur 4's story mode feels incredibly cheap compared to this. You just go from fight to fight with no explanation along the way as to why the character is going there and doing that, and there's nothing. There's no choices to make either. It's just straight shot to the ending. And then you get hilarious moments like in Nightmare's campaign where Tira, who is with you as backup the entire time, is unceremoniously killed off via a little pop-up before the final fight. Soul Calibur 4 is such a weird little game. Anyway, back to Soul Calibur 3. World Competition is a pretty weird mode. For starters, it presents itself as some sort of super competitive game type, which I guess is true, since it has you partake in a bunch of tournaments. You get 12 rounds of tournaments total, and the overall goal is to get to the end without dying. And you have to do it all in one go. If you lose or quit the mode halfway through, then that's too bad. You have to start over from the beginning. And remember what I said about the AI earlier? Yeah, this mode is hell. World Competition feels like genuine filler, which is usually fine in a game that has so much content already, but unlike a simple survival mode, which is a fun way to test your skills in a potentially short amount of time, World Competition is so stressful to play through. And with how inconsistent this AI can be in this game, it's hard to justify putting in too much time here. The mode doesn't even give many rewards for the trouble. You unlock some publicity artwork at the end and you get some gold, but that's about it. Soul Arena gets more interesting. Quick Play is where you'll find the standard arcade mode where you play through 7 stages of random battles before facing off against Abyss at the end. Unfortunately, you don't get to choose a weapon like in Tales of Souls, but you do get to go through it with a custom character. Plus, Quick Play lets you bark your enemies before the fight begins, just like Soul Calibur 2, which is arguably the greatest thing any fighting game has ever included. Yeah! Quick Play is the thing you run through for a quick little sesh of Soul Calibur 3, and it's a good way to test out a character you want to practice in a setting that isn't as slow-paced as Tales of Souls. But it's not really what the star attraction of Soul Arena is. The mission section of Soul Arena is where you can find the real goofy core of Soul Calibur 3. There are 12 missions here that each have you do some wacky stuff, like knocking your opponent into walls to damage them, fighting on a spinning stage which affects you in hilarious ways, or dodging the attacks of a giant statue. As you beat these missions, harder versions of them unlock, and this is where you may or may not spend hours of your time. It's also nice to see that some of the fun concepts from Soul Calibur 2's Weapon Master mode survived in these types of missions, though Soul Calibur 3 definitely has some more fun with them overall. I absolutely love when fighting games do this sort of thing, taking these mechanics and applying them to situations that they were absolutely not designed in mind for makes for some fun stuff to mess around with. But ultimately all this stuff is just a stopgap to unlocking the real meat and potatoes of Soul Calibur 3, the shop. There's the item shop, where you can purchase artwork, weapon exhibitions, and bonus modes for Soul Arena. The weapon shop, which lets you unlock new weapons for the roster, and the armor shop, which lets you buy new cosmetics for the character creator. I feel like any fighting game that has some sort of shop like this is just instantly 10 times better than it would be otherwise. Remember when games let you earn your fun little currency and buy your nice little treats afterward? It really makes you think what the point of modern gaming is sometimes. Character customization has been a part of fighting games for a very long time now. From the simple days of simple color palette swaps to proper alternate costumes for characters. And in Soul Calibur's case, the extra costumes for each character really made the design stand out far more. Sure, they weren't all bangers by any means, but being able to see 2 to 3 different aesthetics on the same character allowed you to catch a glimpse of who they were outside of the battles that took place in the game. The natural extension of this is of course a character creator, which has become an integral part of Soul Calibur's identity starting with this game. And its inclusion here is perhaps the most unique out of every other one in the series. You choose the gender of your fighter to be first, and then their class, with each of these classes being a completely unique fighting style in and of itself, which, if you're only familiar with how the later games do it, might sound crazy. In the later entries, created characters can only use the fighting styles of other roster members, which frankly just looks strange at times. And while that's cool too, I think it's a real shame that unique fighting styles were axed almost immediately after this game. It makes the created characters feel way more unique to play and fight against naturally. And some of these movesets are a crazy amount of fun, with the ninja being my personal favorite. I usually play Siegfried and Nightmare because I'm basic, so playing as a character with a ton of mobility Feels great. This does not mean that I will be changing my ways though. In the actual character creator, you've got a ton of options for how you want your character to look. At the start of the game, your options are fairly limited, but by grinding through Tales of Souls, you can eventually accrue enough money to buy a few parts every time you beat it. There are a ton of parts to collect once you can afford them, and you can get some interesting combinations if you're willing to put the time into unlocking everything. It's also really refreshing how parts rarely seem to clash with each other. If you've played Soul Calibur 6, then you know it's hard to put any interesting ideas together without the game yelling at you for doing something you aren't supposed to. But here, you can mix and match with quite a bit of freedom. The creator isn't super powerful though. You're limited to a few base face types and voices, you can't add any decals or fancy graphic designs to the characters, and some of the clothing options do look a little basic. But you've got enough here to make your budget Solid Snakes and Jill Valentines, and that novelty is enough to make the character creator fun to mess around in. Even if the creations look basic sometimes, you're given just enough to try out some unique ideas within reason. Frankly, I think this creator is my favorite one in the series though, since almost all the items look kinda nice. It's way too easy to make abominations in the later games, which is great if that's what you want, but there's only so many times you can make a variation of Shrek or Gordon Freeman and have it still be funny. Unfortunately, you can't use created characters in Tales of Souls, which is a bit disappointing because I'd like to see how my OC deals with Night Terror, but that doesn't mean you can't do anything with them in a different mode. Chronicles of the Sword is probably the most in-depth side campaign that this series has ever done. Maybe Soul Calibur 6 supersedes it at this point, but I don't know, I think this one is a bit more unique. Chronicles of the Sword is, in essence, a real-time strategy game mixed with Soul Calibur. You first have to make a character who will be the protagonist of this story, and once you've got your budget Sephiroth copy all ready to go, you can get started on the adventure. It begins with some basic setup about how some countries had a war, and then somewhere in the midst of all that is your character, who's just some random guy in an army. They're fighting over what seems to be the only thing of value in this world, Soul Edge, and by proxy Soul Calibur as well, but that's above our pay grade for now. What's important is what this mode actually has you doing, and don't worry, for all my fellow RTS haters out there, this isn't like Civilization or Command and Conquer or, I don't know, Black and White. Does that count? This mode is pretty simple. At the start of a mission, you'll be given victory and loss conditions. You're then asked to sort out your team, which at the start is pretty small. Then all you have to do is give each unit basic instructions, like telling them to go to a base or engage the enemy, which is all done by simply telling them to go somewhere. Then, if a unit encounters an enemy, you're given the choice to actually participate in that battle in a proper Soul Calibur style way. But this battle takes into account the enemy's level and how many enemies you encountered in the field at that time. If you're starting a battle against 2 enemies, then you'll have to 1v2 them unless you've got some backup yourself. In essence, Chronicles of the Sword is a den defense sort of mode where you need to balance defending your locations alongside kicking down the enemy's doors. There's not much in the way of textual depth and mechanics at play. The only real thing to worry about is leveling up your bases so they can defend themselves against enemies for longer, and making a base level 3 can also allow it to revive fallen party members. The true depth from this mode comes from the specific situations that you'll have to deal with, which can get more complex when you have win conditions that require you to do something other than capturing the main enemy base. Like sometimes you'll have to defeat a certain enemy or defeat all enemies on the map, and juggling that sort of thing can be a little bit of a problem at times. What's cool is that you don't necessarily need to be great at Soul Calibur in order to get through the first chunk of Chronicles of the Sword. Unlike Tales of Souls, which absolutely requires some skill or knowledge on how to break the AI in order to get through some of the harder fights, because yeah, it gets rough. In Chronicles of the Sword, you can fall back on strategy to win fights and make use of revival to bounce back from losses. That isn't to say that you'll never have to fight, because you will absolutely need to deal with enemies that way, because it's just the quickest way to do it. Now that being said, Chronicles of the Sword does eventually get hard, just like everything in Soul Calibur 3. Somewhere along the mode's 20 chapters, you're eventually gonna get railroaded hard. This is when being very good at Soul Calibur helps a ton, because you're gonna eventually face enemies that can mess you up hard. Also, since every unit is technically a created character in this mode, you get to learn a bunch of different fighting styles that you probably wouldn't otherwise mess around with. This is honestly a breath of fresh air that's even better if you do come across an actual roster member on the field, because they genuinely do feel like a bigger threat than what you normally face. Seeing Ivy on this map made me absolutely shit myself. Ultimately, Chronicles of the Sword lets you put your OC into the world in such an intriguing way, which the later games do as well, but not with a mode that's anywhere near as interesting as this, I would say. It's just so cool to have a fighting game where a large portion of the content doesn't focus on the fighting game part. A huge portion of Soul Calibur 3 is a strategy game, and even if you don't want to mess with it at all, there's still plenty of other stuff to do in the game. And again, I say this as someone that does not like strategy games. Chronicles of the Sword meshes the DNA of Soul Calibur with something else entirely, like a dream. And if a strategy game exactly like this does exist with real-time fighting game battles and a strategic overworld view, let me know, because I would absolutely give it a shot. This mode is something that I think struggles to bring you in with an interesting hook though, at least at the start. Sure, creating a character is fun, and the first few Chronicles are interesting enough to keep you invested, but it's hard to fully invest in a mode that's as slow-paced as this is when you have Tales of Souls right there. But ultimately, I think that represents what Soul Calibur 3 does so well. It gives players so much content, and even if you don't particularly like one mode, you get so much from all the others too. It truly is one of the best single-player experiences from a fighting game I think I've ever had. This leaves Soul Calibur 3 in an interesting spot these days though. On the one hand, I'm sure the competitive flaws make putting serious time into Soul Calibur 3 pretty frustrating. Luckily, I'm not deep enough into Soul Calibur's ins and outs to recognize these sorts of faults, but all of the single player content on offer here is a must-have for any Soul Calibur fan. Tales of Souls is enough of a reason to spend time with the game, to be honest, and it's certainly difficult enough at times for you to spend a good few hours bashing your head against the wall, but that's basically Soul Calibur 3 in a nutshell. Really fun, with great content that can sometimes be very bad for your mental state.